anywhere. And I was talking with a creative director at another agency. We're collaborating on a project, and I was kind of explaining our approach to this, and he said, it's like, oh yeah, I agree. I've been calling this avoiding dead documents. I think that's a great way to describe that, is avoid dead documents, avoid creating documents that have no life beyond the end of the project. It's both a waste of time and resources, and also just can be a distraction. Yeah, can go the wrong direction.
By a dead document, do you mean a static presentation necessarily?
Yeah, I mean anything like a wireframe that's after you get agreement from a client is useless. That wireframe is never going to be live anywhere. I mean, it serves as a blueprint for a designer. But it's not something that has any use beyond that.
Trash it.
Exactly.
Because you're going to improve on it anyway.
Exactly.
Or change it.
And the same thing with the sitemap. Like spending time creating this kind of polished sitemap when you can do the same thing with a bulleted list. Why do it? Okay. And I mean, it's a waste of time, a waste of money, and it's not spending time on things that matter. It's spending time on things that don't matter.
Okay. Thank you.
There are some documents that we don't avoid. Get to here. So what happens when terms are not clearly communicated? And the challenge here, I should probably go back here. And the challenge here is communicating your terms. So make sure that change gears a little bit and talk about kind of the contract side and the deal side. Make sure you communicate your terms clearly. What happens when terms are not clearly communicated? I think this is, again, pretty clear. The deal changes, and it changes it can change in really bad ways if you're not specific and clear and get agreement about this up front. Is there anybody here that doesn't use a contract? Does there, like, freelance? Do you guys all use contracts when you're working with clients, I assume? Okay, cool. That's good. Keep doing that. Contracts are critical. I mean, it's such an overlooked point. There's a great presentation by Mike Montero, I believe his name is, called "F You Pay Me." Have any of you seen this? It's great, and he gives his present. I mean, the title's a little outrageous. He's actually both confident and very humble in his approach, and again, very appreciative of his clients. But he makes some great points about the importance of clearly stating your terms and expecting clients to deliver on those terms and holding them accountable from a legal perspective. And they should do the same for you. I mean, the contract goes both ways. We have a 11 or 12-page contract that we've worked on for like 8 years, I think, and we keep finding, we keep adding new stuff to it. I had an issue not too long ago, and was speaking with my attorney, and a new attorney, so he's reviewing the contract for the first time, sitting in his office. I sit there while he reads through the whole thing. It's like 20 minutes or $300 or something. he drops the contract on the table and says, "Well, Justin, you're right. This is a time and materials agreement." He could have said that in a sentence, but this is a time and materials agreement. And I think the bottom line there is, contracts don't have to be 12 pages long, but they do need to clearly spell out what your terms are.
I have a question about that, just maybe because you're willing to share an answer. I had a client recently that was really weirded out by the whole open source thing, and especially like some of the license terms vis-a-vis Drupal. And I'm not an attorney, but I basically explained to her, I'm like, you don't have to give the world the work that I deliver to you.
Right.
Like, I have to deliver it to you under whatever license I have to, theoretically, because it plugs in with Drupal.
Right.
Have you run into that at all, or?
As long as that code isn't distributed,
well,
it's theirs.
Right. That's basically my answer was, I'm distributing it to you. I have to do it under this license, but you don't have to distribute it to anybody.
Yeah, that is a great question. That's something that I think you have to navigate like with an attorney, and I don't think I have a great answer to that. It's something that comes up in a lot of our projects. One of the 12 pages in our agreement is about ownership and about what we retain rights to and what they retain rights to. The last thing I want is to turn around and try to work on another project and have a client claiming intellectual property on this thing we just finished for them. That just wouldn't work for us. And that does throw some people off. I mean, that has been, I can think of one case specifically where I felt like a month I spent talking to this guy on a project that wasn't, it wasn't insignificant, but it wasn't huge, and back and forth, ended up not happening for other reasons. But yeah, I think that's something you have to navigate with your attorney. It is something you want to you want to be clear about it though. I mean, it's a great point that that's one of those things that's challenging, and you want to be crystal clear about who owns the code, who can do what with it. In our case, we retain rights in the code is the way we put it, unless it's governed by the GPL, in which case whatever we say doesn't even matter. But we retain rights to the code. The client has a license to do absolutely whatever they want to with it. So they can do whatever they want to, but it's ours. And that includes like distributing it, getting somebody else to work on it. They have full, complete license to it, but it's they can't go back later and say, our property. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you have any kind of formalized discovery process for IP issues like that? Where, as opposed to waiting to the 11th hour when the client, kind of says, well, I plan on doing this, and maybe you hadn't thought or iterated through a process of having your code go through something like that?
That's a great question. No, we don't. I haven't done that, and that's a good point. I think that's something. We've had lots of conversations about ownership. Probably 1 in 3 contracts before we get a signature, we have an extended conversation about ownership because of this page or two in our contract. It's usually still not a big enough issue to have like a full discovery process around it, at least in my experience. It hasn't been something where I've thought, hey, we need to stop and turn this into a product or into a day-long thing where we figure this out. So comes up, but hasn't come up to that scale. Things like upfront payment, which we absolutely ask for every single time, anywhere from 25 to 50% on smaller projects, typically 25 to 30%. Payment terms, it's totally fine to ask for payment on your terms. Very rarely do we get pushback on this. I think, so we ask for payment on receipt, and then the actual term it has to be within 30 days. We've made exceptions for, like the federal government's not going to pay you often not going to pay you unless a month. And if they say they're not, there's nothing to do about it. So we'll work. We make exceptions there, and we've done some stuff with like the UN, same thing. What are we going to do? Worst comes to worst, will you give money back? And we say absolutely not. But we want to be clear about that, because if we're not clear, if a client pays something up front and then 3 weeks into it decides that this isn't really what they expected, we want to be clear about the fact that that's fine, but you've made an investment, we've also made an investment already, and for whatever reason, it's in the contract, and we say there's no way, absolutely not, we can't do provide money back. And I've had that I can think of, I've had one extended conversation about that last point, and we still left it in the contract. It's not something, I've never had anyone totally balk at that. Another big issue with contracting, and we learned this one the hard way, unfortunately, is knowing who you're working with.
Yes.
Making sure, and there are lots of levels to this. I'll talk about some really specific ones. We had a project, sadly not terribly long ago, where we went through the entire process, and frankly, some things that we've already talked about were sort of not quite right already by the time we got to this point. So get to the end of the project, literally the very end of the project, and the client whose business existed solely for the purpose of this project that we were working on with them decided enough was enough. They weren't going to fund this anymore, and they were going to walk. Not only were they going to walk, but this business where they had this idea, they were going to build this application. They were just going to disband the business and walk away. And they're an LLC. We spent very little time pursuing this legally, because the bottom line was, it's a limited liability corporation. They had no assets, they had no clients, they had just an idea and some capital from another company. There's some very, very complex legal constructs that you might be able to apply to this, but unless you're talking, hundreds of thousands of dollars, it just isn't worth the time. We weren't quite at that level, but we were, upwards of 30%. We were holding the bag for upwards of 30% on the overall engagement, which was a multi-month project. So know who you're dealing with. And I think it's totally fine, if you're dealing with a limited liability corporation, find out who's funding the corporation and hold them accountable. Or find out who the partners are in the organization and make sure that they personally guarantee the contract. So you're in essence, you're committing your time the same way a bank commits funds, or the same kind of thing. It's completely legitimate to hold the people accountable the same way a bank would.
In that spirit, have you screwed with escrow at all?
I haven't. Is that something you've have experience with, or?
I just had not personally, I've never felt the need to, but I'm very selective about who I work with.
Right.
Which is, you get burned once, but No, I had somebody who said that he was trying to engage a developer or freelancer who he didn't trust, you know, and would
Right.
put money into it. It just sounded very, I mean, it sounded like it might work, but it was also very cumbersome.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you don't, trust is a big deal up front. And getting this stuff into contract, there are other things you can do. I mean, making sure that your billing stays in step with the work that you're doing, so not getting too far ahead. I would be really careful, even when being selective about who you're working with. You just, if things really fall apart, you want to have it crystal clear in your contract what happens next. In general, we're pretty cautious about startups. We've worked with some really great startups. We're finishing a project right now for an awesome startup, a really incredible project. We're very careful about this, though. We want to make sure that people are highly invested in the idea, that there are methods in place for holding them accountable, that we stay in step with them from a billing perspective and make sure that we're not, months out on work that hasn't been paid for. Then, another big question in this: what if the project changes? Sidetracked. I mean, anyone, I assume some of you guys have had the experience of a client who gets into a project and gets sidetracked. Their priorities change. I mean, this happens. Projects can span weeks to for us, usually months. So you're usually talking about 3 months on the very fast short end, 12 months on kind of the longer end, and maybe 6 to 9 in between. And in that span, priorities can change, and things can happen, and a client may have to for perfectly legitimate reasons, not continue the project. What happens next needs to be spelled out really clearly from a contracting perspective. Last challenge I want to talk about is just being clear and specific about price. I'll talk a little bit about my perspective on time and materials versus fixed billing. There are 4 elements, I think, that come to bear on this whole issue of price, time and materials, fixed billing, regardless of what your approach is with that. I think that the first is clients need a finished product. Finished is totally up to interpretation, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and that's one of the biggest questions in this whole project. But clients need a finished product. Clients absolutely have a finite budget. Regardless of how big the budget is, it's finite. Time costs money. Again, no matter how you pay your people, how you get the work done, time absolutely costs money. And time is impossible to forecast. No matter how good you get at estimating projects, it's never going to be perfect. And to put it really simply, you'll win some, you'll lose some as far as the way estimates work. We favor fixed bidding, I should say, as I talk about this finished thing. I favor fixed bidding because I think that it's because it's competitive. And that's the biggest thing, is it's easier to sell a fixed bid project. And there are lots of unknowns when a client takes on a project. And I feel like making the money a total known and not an unknown is extremely advantageous for being competitive. That said, we want to be really careful up front and make sure that we've, as clearly as possible, define what finished means and define what our estimates mean. We have now in our contract language that says the definition of finished is basically if the software provides, in a very general way, the functionality that we described in a deliverable. Now, a deliverable is like one line. If the software does that thing, and it's at or just over the hours that we said it would be, then that's a client can't hold us accountable to spend hours and hours and hours and hours beyond our estimate. Now, if we get into something, and the language is a little bit complex. I probably should have thrown it up here, but if we get into something, we have to make it work. Like, we have to at least deliver that one-line thing, right? But a one-line thing could be like shopping cart. How many ways are there to describe a shopping cart? A shopping cart can get really ridiculous. And one of the ways we define that being finished is how close that is to the estimated hours. Usually we're not quite that general, but that's kind of an example of how that can work.
So can you talk about how you use hours then if you're doing fixed price or fixed price bidding? Because I don't even bother to tell clients about hours if I do a project bid.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do hours because, essentially, even though we're doing fixed bidding takes out the risk for clients. It's still based on hours. Like, that's still what we have to sell. We're developers, we're consultants. The currency that we have to trade is our time. And so the estimate is based on the number of hours. And that helps show a client, you know, where the value is, where the money's going really, like why does this thing cost $5,000? It costs $5,000 because it takes, you know, several days to build. So that's how we approach that. That's also how we create estimates. Like we distribute spreadsheets, and John is our business development director. We can talk maybe more about this, but we distribute spreadsheets with all of the deliverables. We turn an RFP into actionable items or deliverables, and basically pass that around the office and get everyone's estimates. If there are big discrepancies between two people's estimates, we'll talk about it, try to figure out what's, you know, why is this and what's really going on here and what should this estimate be. That's the process we use to work that out. And then, yeah, we share that information with clients. That also helps them. I mean, I hate getting into the process of picking things out of a proposal. I mean, who wants to do that, I guess? But it's still helpful for clients to then prioritize things.
They can figure out what's driving up their price.
Exactly, yeah. Something else that, actually John and I were just talking about this the other day, something else that we've been doing recently is being really clear about what is an optional deliverable also. And that is, that's partly to tell them what else is available, but also partly to be crystal clear about what's not in this project today. So a content migration is going to take 3 weeks, but it's an optional deliverable. It's not part of the project. When we get to that phase, you are not there. There's no way there can be surprise with this. Some of the issues around that, I guess. With regard to finished, we spend a lot of time talking about priorities, and I think you hear that a lot with iterative approach to development, agile approach, and what have you. Is just making sure that you're focusing on priorities and hitting high priorities first. Do a lot of talking about what the budget is up front. If we do, we do sometimes do time and materials. If I really just don't know what something's going to take, and we're finishing now a project that is a time and materials project. Had no idea what this was going to take. We had some idea. We had a huge range of what it could take, and we, while we didn't have this in the contract, we highly recommended that the client have 20% on top of the high end of the range in hand. Bottom line is we want to make sure that people have a clear expectation of budget and that they have the money to spend, obviously. And for us, a lot of this comes back to just how far are we willing to bend, you know, and when we provide fixed fees, the hard conversations still come about what's finished, what isn't finished, and what are we going to do, what are we not going to be able to do. For me, a long-term client, the longer we can keep a client, the more valuable they become. The profit margin gets way better when you don't have to go through the sales process, when you don't have somebody kind of nitpicking every detail, when you can just do the work. We'll typically do fixed fee up front, and then it converts after that initial engagement to time and materials. And it's just, they ask for something, we do it. It's in the bill every month. Extremely simple. It's not, maintenance is not the most exciting part of what we do, but the margin is incredible. And I mean, we like to keep our clients satisfied. It's also just a really great sales tool. And having, for me, it's worth bending to have that referral and have that sales tool. Knowing how far I'm going to bend beforehand is really important. You know, you want to know ahead of time how far you can, how flexible you can be. And then one area we're not flexible on is getting paid. This is an article from UX magazine from several years ago. Pay fast, which I agree with, but isn't so much what we're talking about today. Get paid faster. The idea that collect early, collect often, I guess you'd say. It's a quote from this article that says, we're not a bank. If you want to continue to be our customer, you need to stop treating us like one. You certainly don't want to start paying us like one. I wouldn't say that to a client. But, I mean, we do. When we send an invoice, we typically follow up with an email that says, want to make sure you got the invoice. And often, depending on who the client is, when should we expect to receive payment? If 2 weeks goes by, I'll shoot an email, just a personal note, hey, I want to make sure you got that invoice, when should we expect this? This is another thing where in 11 years of doing this kind of work, we've had literally one client who I recall balking a bit at that, and I can still absolutely say with confidence that I don't want to work for clients that have a problem with that.
A problem of being billed?
Yeah, seriously, a problem of exactly agreeing to a due on receipt payment term and then feeling like
they're being
They didn't
bothered.
like
yeah, like it was out of line. Yeah, like they'll get to it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, cool.
And you know, and that's the kind of thing that, I mean, that's another example of something that just has to be in the contract and crystal clear up front. Some organizations are used to 30, even 60. I mean, some companies will doing like 90-day terms, which is ridiculous. And being crystal clear up front that we can't do that. This is what you're agreeing to do. Again, unless it's an organization where I know they're good for it, like the government, I hope. And I'm willing to wait a little longer. That's pretty much it. In conclusion, clearly describe the process, maintain focus on goals, communicate your terms, clear and specific about price. These are 4 issues that we deal with a lot. And I think some of the biggest opportunity for improving the process is in getting those things right. Thanks, everybody. Please give me feedback. We're asked to direct everyone to use surveys online, so if you can fill out the survey. And I think we still have a couple minutes, or
Yeah.
we have a couple more minutes for questions, or
I don't know, I've asked a lot of questions, so if anybody does anybody have any more questions? Since you've been in this business for a long time, and I'm transitioning to somebody who bills as opposed to is billed for this stuff, doing project management, can you talk about clients' tolerance for prices right now? Because I know 10, 11 years ago, we were in the midst of .com bubble, and I think people's perceptions of value is very different. And I've done bids lately where I bid what it's worth, which I think is more than the client was expecting to get a bid for.
right.
But I ended up getting the business because you could make a case for that. And
Yeah, there have been there's been a lot of talk about this, I think, in the Drupal community specifically recently. There was a session at Chicago, DrupalCon in Chicago, about the whole issue of billing and hourly rates. And I think everyone says, if you think you can raise your rate, if you're even considering raising your rate, do it. Basically keep doing it until you do get that pushback. I think the tolerance, usually if you're even considering that, the answer is yes, you can afford to do this. So I mean, that's been our experience too. We've raised rates a couple times in the last year or so, and it's I don't think there's been any real consequence to that. So. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, one thing that you're talking about, the concept of like, especially with clients establishing your terms clearly up front, establishing your expectations for prices, all these things you're talking about. I mean, aside from covering yourself from not getting paid, one of the other advantages is you'll uncover a flake a lot sooner than if you wait or if you're not prompt about communicating what your expectations are. And I mean, we've learned that the hard way back before we started doing what you're talking about. You'll find out if somebody's serious. You know, if you ask what their if you start talking about payment and they get real uncomfortable and you get all kinds of weird pushback, you might not want to do business with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you absolutely don't want to do business with them. I think you're
Yeah,
right.
there's no
That's the
mind
thing is
about
like, ask if you have trouble. I mean, you want to make sure that people will agree to what your needs are. You definitely don't want to find that out after you've spent 3 months working.
Well, it's easy for me to say now that I've been in business for a while and we've got established clients. When you're starting out, you're so hungry to get business.
Right.
And you don't want to piss your clients off, and you don't want to seem, it's tough. You don't want to seem too greedy, I suppose.
Right.
But I mean, I learned the hard way, unfortunately, to survive it, but you have to do exactly what Justin's saying.
I know you work mostly with nonprofits, but does anyone here have experience working on equity trades or entertain that conversation, equity position for work?
Hell to the no.
Yeah. I was gonna say we actually we talk more about our nonprofit work. We do a lot of commercial stuff. Regardless, I think that actually sums up pretty well. We won't do it. There's no way. Yeah.
was it you that posted that question on Drupal.org? Somebody asked about that recently. And it just seems to me that a lot of those people aren't able to raise cash equity. If they've got, I mean, if people have venture capital and they've attracted cash in the bank, then either they have money to pay you, or that might be a reason to think that other people are serious about it, and that maybe you should entertain it, but only then.
It's not the business I'm in either.
Yeah.
Like I'm not in whatever it is. I'm not
You
in
should become an
manufacturing.
investor,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
And if you
exactly.
want equity,
Exactly.
you should
I mean,
invest.
if you go find, if somebody has an idea that you think is so awesome, man, I'm going to stop what I'm doing and I'm going to pursue that with them. That's really the right context for that, I think. And there are, I mean, that happens with development shops a lot, I think, where you go from being a development shop to being a product provider, a product creator. So I think that there's a time, there's a place for that. But if a client's asking, like some of you guys have said, that's a clear indication that why couldn't they get the money? And yeah, there are all kinds of concerns I have with that. I'd be concerned about them like valuing the work at an appropriate level also. So, yeah.
One time I pitched doing that for a reduced rate. I was excited about a software project that I was doing for someone, and I offered to do at half my rate for an equity position. I brought it up, and he said no.
Oh, really?
It's like, no, I want to make all the money off this software. I'll pay your normal rate. And as it turned out, it went down in flames, so I'm glad it went down.
A million shares of nothing is nothing.
Yeah, well, it was software support, particular hardware, and within a year the hardware went away. And so that was, his market evaporated.
I think that's
Dodge
actually
that bullet.
maybe not in that case, but I think that's a sign actually of a better client and a better project when they're not willing to share equity. I mean, they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be any more willing to share equity than I should be to want that equity. We're two businesses operating in two different spheres. It's not very compatible, I don't think. Very rarely is it compatible. There was another, you had a...
Yeah, I was just wondering how you combat, scope creep in a fixed bid contract. Because I've heard people say that they budget 30% is just in scope creep. I'm wondering if you do something like that.
Yeah, we don't really have a specific amount. The couple of things that we do to protect ourselves with scope creep is first just in the way we estimate. So we try to get, everybody on the team is very aware of the hours that we're quoting. Everyone is very aware of what the hours we spend on something similar were before. We keep that stuff really transparent. And because of the distributed approach to estimating up front, I think that absolutely helps. As I said before, language in our contract that says we don't know exactly what this is going to take. This is what we're estimating it's going to take. We guarantee you'll get something that's working, but you can't interpret this to the greatest possible interpretation, to the largest possible interpretation. Honestly, it just comes back, I think the biggest thing is it just comes back to often not the most comfortable conversations, but important conversations of deciding what is really finished. We can't do X, Y, and Z. We can do these three things, but not those two things, or this is taking longer than we expected, and just having those conversations early. Make sure that your agreement is set up to protect you in those settings. And yeah, unfortunately, I think it comes back to understanding and setting priorities in the project and defining that idea of finished.
I've found like a really good way to do that is to have a super detailed list of specific deliverables, and I just include it as like an appendix to my contract. And it just says that these things are done, and they're written just like you said, user will be able to upload a listing, a house listing with a photo.
Mm-hmm.
If that's done, and it just says these are minimum requirements. I even say I might deliver more than this, and we might agree to style things verbally, but in case of a conflict, this is what you get. And it's easier to amend. I make it easier to amend than the contract, so that the client feels like if they have a good idea, I'm happy to amend it, right? Or I'm happy to change things around. And it just says that you can do that by mutual agreement.
We had a client very similar to that recently where we ended up handing off the product and it was finished, but they had increased the scope of what they wanted to do so greatly that we knew that there was absolutely no way they were going to be able to fund it with kind of money that they had. So it was just sort of polite. Well, we'll finish up to this point, which we agreed to in the original contract. We're a year later. We're more than happy to help you transition to another developer if need be. We're more than happy to give you X number of hours gratis for that transition. But I agree with Justin. You have to be really, really firm about it.
Yeah, and it's not. It's those conversations suck often. And sometimes they do. Not always, but it's not easy. And I think that just having those conversations early and identifying where scope really is creeping, and where you have this, and making sure. It's really important to me that people understand up front that there is going to be a wide range of possible interpretations for what we're talking about here, and neither we nor the client know, exactly what this is going to look like and exactly what the effort is. And that language is in our contract. And so it's something that they signed it, yes, they understand that, and they're not gonna hold us responsible. By the same token, we do have to say, we have to provide them an e-commerce system that works. They have to be able to put a product in a shopping cart, go through a checkout process.
We document all of our conversations with clients in Open Atrium, and one of our requirements in our contract is that they have to confirm that this was indeed the what we talked about, and that in that way that if we do get to a place where we have one of these uncomfortable conversations, we're able to say, well, let's go back and take a look at the history and be very dispassionate about the happenings, and that works really well. I find that it makes the client think a whole lot more about what they're asking, and at the same time protects you from potentially getting burned.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an awesome point. Documentation is so important, and even just really simple documentation. I had a conversation, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, from a client who kind of walked away at the very end of the project, and they came back and were surprised that something wasn't included in the project, and we had like very clear emails from 6 months ago and 6 months before that about this issue already. I was a little frustrated that I was having to have this like uncomfortable conversation a second time, and it was very nice to be able to say, hey, wait, let me look for this email and just resend the email and be done with it. So.
What do you do when you have a client that doesn't have this clear, they don't have the acceptance criteria? They have a general concept, but you can't budget your time around that, so you can't give them an estimate. You just charge a discovery phase, I'm assuming?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a few things we'll do. One is, it totally depends on the scale of what they're talking about. One is just treat that as part of the sales process. So that's kind of on the low end of what that might be. That'll just be part of the sales process for us. And we'll work on actually helping the client create their RFP. And that's a really powerful sales tool too. If we already have a totally committed new client who just wants to work with us, I might not be so willing to help them create the RFP. It might not be necessary, Right. But if it's a client who's not sure what they want, they're developing this idea, they're likely going to talk to multiple shops. And we encourage people to talk to multiple shops when they come to us with ideas. We'll help create the RFP, and that's really powerful. And it's a great part of the sales process. That's kind of on the lower end. If it's something
I charge for that.
We don't charge. No.
Do it for free?
Yeah.
You write it so that only you can do it.
Well, it's not. It really isn't that. But there is something. It gets the collaboration process going already, and.
We no longer have to explain the RFP to you, so that's
yeah. It doesn't take any more time. Yeah, exactly. It's not like you have to have. You're gonna have to spend some time. Usually, most companies spend some time in the sales process. There's some loss of time and money there. But anyways, to answer your question, we'll do that. We will sometimes do a discovery process. It's a paid discovery process. So we'll say, hey, we've talked for weeks. We still have no idea what this is going to take. Let's do a paid discovery process. And then as a result of that paid discovery process, we'll either do a fixed project or a time and materials project. I've mentioned a project a couple times that we're just in the process of finishing now. It's a pretty large time and materials project, and we did that. We didn't know up front, so we talked with them for a while. We still didn't know. We did a paid discovery. Still didn't know very well. We did a range with time and materials, and it's been. It's been great. It hasn't been without the same challenges about establishing priorities and things like that. But it's worked. It's worked well.
Does everybody in the shop work from that RFP, or does that RFP sort of synthesize into a more detailed spec doc?
That's a really great question. Let's see. We'll take the client's RFP, have sales meetings with them, create a proposal. The proposal has line item deliverables in it. If that turns into a project, we will put the deliverables in. We use Basecamp for project management. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with that. We'll put the deliverables in Basecamp as to-dos, and then through the course of the project, as we expand the meaning of those to-dos, those go into additional to-do lists. So that's basically, we try to track, I think at this point we're tracking those details. The only scope document we have usually is to-do lists with comments. Does that I mean, occasionally we'll have documents that map out some,
Proposal goes into to-dos.
right, proposal goes,
Deliverables.
deliverables go into to-dos, as specific to-dos, and then we expand on those as we need to. And we always need to. I mean, that's never enough. If by the end of the 90% of the way through a project, we have these massive to-do lists that we're kind of blowing
I
through.
would think that this, that the RFP is enough to get you in the ballpark, but maybe not nearly enough to work from.
No, exactly. But I mean, that process is, I guess you could say, is iterative like the rest of the process, in that we start with the simple list of the deliverables that we actually talked about. And that's really great, because you can go back and, I mean, we keep that to-do list really clean. It just says deliverables and a list of all the deliverables and to-dos. So when we're done, we can check it off. And so it's a very easy way to say, hey, this particular piece is done. Move on. Cool. I think we're about out of time. Thanks, everybody.